It doesn't matter what parents decide is best for their children. It doesn't matter what patients would choose for themselves. And it doesn't matter if doctors believe this treatment is essential for individual patients. SB 1 categorically bans treatment when, and only when, it's inconsistent with the patient's birth sex.
Much of the latter part of your opening statement suggests that it seemed to suggest that there's an outright ban on this treatment, but that's not the case. It's really for minors. So why isn't this simply a case of age classification when it comes to these treatments as opposed to a ban, as you suggested in your opening statement?
It's certainly true, Justice Thomas, that the statute classifies based on age, but it packages that age classification with a sex restriction and says that for all adolescents, you cannot take these medications if they're inconsistent with your sex.
If that's true, doesn't that make a stronger case for us to leave those determinations to the legislative bodies rather than try to determine them for ourselves?
Obviously, anytime you're thinking about a medical intervention, you need to weigh risks and benefits. But the state has come in here, and in a sharp departure from how it normally addresses this issue, it has completely decided to override the views of the parents, the patients, the doctors who are grappling with these decisions and trying to make those trade-offs.
Tennessee claims this sex-based line drawing is justified to protect children. But SB 1 has taken away the only treatment that relieved years of suffering for each of the adolescent plaintiffs. And critically, Tennessee's arguments that SB 1 is sex neutral would apply if the state banned this care for adults too. By banning treatment only when it allows an adolescent to live, identify, or appear inconsistent with their birth sex, SB 1 warrants heightened scrutiny under decades of precedent.
Tennessee lawmakers enacted SB 1 to protect minors from risky, unproven medical interventions. The law imposes an across-the-board rule that allows the use of drugs and surgeries for some medical purposes, but not for others. Its application turns entirely on medical purpose, not a patient's sex. That is not sex discrimination. As Justice Kavanaugh recognized throughout his questioning, they cannot stand up here and say that if these alternatives were imposed, that there would be no detransitioners. So they cannot eliminate the risk of detransitioners. So it becomes a pure exercise of weighing benefits versus risk. And the question of how many minors have to have their bodies irreparably harmed for unproven benefits is one that is best left.
I'm sorry, Counselor. Every medical treatment has a risk, even taking aspirin. There is always going to be a percentage of the population under any medical treatment that's going to suffer a harm. So the question in my mind is not, do policymakers decide whether one person's life is more valuable than the millions of others who get relief from this treatment? The question is, can you stop one sex from the other, one person of one sex from another sex, from receiving that benefit?
Well, Your Honor, of course, our position is that there is no sex-based classification, but to finish the answer, that to the extent that a law dealing with adults would pass rational basis review, that just means it's left to the democratic process, and that democracy is the best check on potentially misguided laws.
So when you're 1% of the population, when you're 1% of the population or less, very hard to see how the democratic process is going to protect you.
Well, Your Honor,
you blacks were a much larger part of the population, and it didn't protect them. It didn't protect women for whole centuries.
I'm less interested in sort of like the legal box to put this in, and more interested in, you're spending a lot of time talking about what exactly the classification is here, and I think we've talked a good deal about that. But what produced this classification might be relevant to understanding what the classification is about.
Absolutely, and I would love to address it.
And what seems to have produced this classification is that we want to ban treatments that might encourage minors to become disdainful of their sex. So we think that there's something fundamentally wrong, fundamentally bad about youth who are trying to transition. And that's the way this purpose seems to me.